Okay, so back again. Going to start up again right where we left off. And so, all right, here we go. So we talked last time about official activity should be the worker's focus in modern bureaucratic systems and how that was different from previous times when work and family life were really integrated. Now we need to move on to the last and arguably most important of all the different aspects of bureaucratic systems according to Weber, and that's that jobs are governed by rules, which seems, again, like another kind of silly, pointless thing to point out, because aren't all jobs governed by rules? Haven't they always been governed by rules? Well, the answer to that really is no. And even when in the past they have been governed by rules, they haven't been governed by rules in the same kind of formal way that they are now. So a quick thing I want to point out before jumping to a bunch of examples to illustrate is that within bureaucratic systems, these rules need to be stable, exhaustive, and they need to be able to be learned. So stable just means they can't be changing all the time. That really goes along with their ability to be learned. If you are, for instance, working at Best Buy, let's say, you're a salesperson at Best Buy, and one day you're supposed to dress one way. There's a certain dress code for you on Monday, and then you walk in on Tuesday, and there's a completely different dress code. Well, that's going to be really difficult for you to deal with because it changed so quickly. You have to go out and buy new clothes. You have to go out there and get yourself prepared for these new rules, and then you come back the next day and there's something else. People are going to get really frustrated with that, and they're not going to be able to meet the requirements. They're just not going to. At some point, you're not going to be able to buy any more clothes. Same thing if you're working at a job where, let's say, you're an accountant and the rules are, they're one day the rules are for calculating total costs are one thing. The next day there's something completely different. The day after that there's something else, and they just change drastically and quickly. You're not going to be able to do your job effectively. The exhaustiveness, this one's not something you probably think about too much, but it's really, really important for Weber. The rules need to be exhaustive, and what that means is the rules need to cover every possible situation that comes up. So I worked at Radio Shack for a long time, which is not a place anybody should ever work. It's actually out of business now, so haha, screw you, Radio Shack. But when I was working at Radio Shack, we have rules to govern everything. So if someone comes in, they want to return something. Well, I didn't decide. I didn't listen to the person's sob story about why they didn't want the wires that they bought or the computer that they bought or whatever, and then make a decision myself about whether or not they could return the product. There were rules laid out for me, and those rules are supposed to cover every possible situation that could come up. Every once in a while, things would come up that I didn't know what to do, and so in that situation, I would have to talk to my manager, and then my manager make a decision. If my manager couldn't make the decision, then it got passed on up to his boss and to his boss's boss, all the way up through the system. So they need to be exhaustive to cover everything. What's really key about this, and this is going to have a pretty big implication later, is that there aren't going to be any situations where the individual worker is going to have a chance to exercise any kind of creativity or any kind of unique response, or a response that's really able to take the individual people into account. So let's say when I was at Radio Shack, our return policy was you get a full refund if you had a receipt, you were returning the item within 30 days, and it was resellable, which means that it was in good condition, you sell the box and all that stuff. Well, what if it's day 31 and somebody comes in and they have a receipt, it's resellable, but again, 31 days, but the person tells a story about how, well, they had been sick and in the hospital for a long time, and so they couldn't get in quickly enough to return the item, and this is a really expensive thing, and they really need the money because now they have all these medical bills, and it's really important for their kids, and they needed to pay their utility bills, and if they can't pay their utility bills, then their water's going to get turned off, which is going to be horrible. Well, I don't get to take any of that into account as a salesperson. I have to just enforce the rules. And then if the customer gets mad at me, I can just say, or I could just say, like, look, that's the rule. I don't have any control over it. I don't want to get fired. And then I can pass the person up to my manager who would have more power to bend the rules, but I certainly didn't. So the rules, again, need to be stable, they need to be exhaustive, and they need to be learned. That's just an obvious one. If people can't learn the rules, then they can't follow them. So what we have here is an old return policy from Staples.com. This is back from 2007, so obviously this is pretty out of date, but who cares, right? This is just their system they had then. And so they have these pretty detailed overviews of what their rules are. And so if you call the 1-800 number to get service from them and you want to return something, the person at the other end of the phone line doesn't get to make the decision themselves about whether or not you can return the product. That person has to follow the return policy. Same thing if you walk into the store. So one of the key things about jobs being governed by rules is that these rules take decision making out of the hands of the individual workers. They become these stable rules that everyone needs to follow, and people don't make decisions anymore. Now, it's really important that these rules are there in order for the system to function, because if every individual salesperson at every Radio Shack or Best Buy or Staples, just to give an example, had their own individual return policy, and I at Radio Shack was willing to take back anything that anybody brought back in, no matter how long ago it was, no matter how much, how bad a shape the product was in, and then the guy standing next to me would only take things back after a week with the receipt and so on. Well, the business is going to function that way. Same thing if you have a big organization and one person in the accounting department is going to document the bills or going to do the taxes in one way, and someone else is going to do it in an entirely different way. Well, what happens when those two people need to combine their work? Well, they're not going to be able to. What happens when one of those two people quit and somebody else has to come in and they have to make sense of everything that these other people have done over the years? Well, they won't be able to make sense of it because there's no stable rules. It's all just people doing things at random. So the system requires rules, and the system requires that everyone follow those rules. But at the individual level, it becomes difficult because the individual person lacks control over themselves, their behavior, and so on. They don't get to act creatively in any way. And we start to see the beginning here, and there's been hints of this throughout the other aspects of bureaucracy, but we start to see the hints of what Weber's big problem is going to be with bureaucratic systems, and that's they create this kind of alienation. It's different from Marx's alienation, but there is this alienation that you can start to see that Weber's hinting at here. But we'll talk about that in more detail in a bit. But so I want to show you a couple more examples of some other policies that I found, some corporate policies that I found online. These are all retail type places. So over here in the bottom right, that's Walmart. There's some rules. That's a rule posting for Walmart. Up top on the right, I think that's Urban Outfitters. That's just a policy for on-call shifts. So that an on-call shift is someone who isn't technically working but needs to be available in case someone calls out. And then we have the dress code, or part of the dress code policy for women who work at Hooters. And so we can see with the dress code policy, it is really, really specific. So for instance, we go through here, there's rules about jewelry. There are rules about the look, and look is all in capitals because if you look in more depth into the employee manual, which they posted online for Hooters, they have all this stuff about the look and how what the look is supposed to convey and what goes into the look and all this. And so Hooters as a company is really incredibly focused on appearances. And so women who work at this place will not be able to choose, for instance, their own clothing, won't have very much control over what they wear or how they appear. They give up that control to the organization itself. So 1 necklace maximum, there's no choker's beads, 2 bracelets, no tongue piercing. There's an entire paragraph here about fingernails and how fingernails are supposed to be maintained. There's uniform stuff. There's descriptions about how different body parts are supposed to look within the context of the clothing. It's really pretty detailed. And again, this is part of I think a 50-something page manual. Not entirely focused on appearance, but a lot of it's focused on appearance. Appearance is the kind of central theme that runs through the manual. Then we have this really detailed description of what people are supposed to do when they're on call. So when you're on call, you have to call a manager 3 hours before the start of your on-call shift. You have to speak directly to a manager. Cell phone calls, text messages aren't acceptable, and so on. They're really specific procedures that you have to follow in order to meet the requirements of being an on-call shift. And then we have Walmart here. This isn't their employee manual or anything. This is just some notifications that were posted on a wall at Walmart. So you can see things about the name badges that they used to have to wear in the past, and then the organization got rid of the name badges, and now they're bringing them back. They are talking about dress codes, all kinds of different things. They're talking about the radio stations, what kind of music can be played. So you can see here, there's just some hints of this, of just the degree to which bureaucratic systems regulate and control people's behavior. And so it's not just the customer's behavior with things like return policies, but it's also the employees. So retail stores, they're governing what people wear, what people say. If you look at, if you ever worked at a bank, so, I've known people who worked at Bank of America for a long time, and those people, when they worked there, had to follow these in really detailed scripts about how they were supposed to take the customers through the process of, for instance, opening an account. And they had all these questions that they're supposed to ask, and those questions were supposed to lead to conversations that were also tightly scripted, that lead to conversations about opening other kinds of accounts or buying other kinds of services from Bank of America. So everything that people are, not everything, but the kinds of things people are saying, the kinds of conversations they're allowed to have, the kinds of things they're allowed to wear, the ways they're supposed to go about solving problems and doing their work, all that stuff is extremely regulated and extremely controlled. If you look at the article from Robin Liebner on McDonald's, that's posted on the course website, you'll see just the crazy number of rules and regulations regulation is the wrong word, but rules that McDonald's employees follow, which that place is extreme. So you should check it out. It's really pretty eye-opening. But anyway, so the key point here is that there are an enormous number of rules within these systems. Well, so there are some massive bureaucracies massive advantages to bureaucratic systems. The first is that there's just really no other way to organize modern societies. So if you just think about Framingham State University, so the university that we're all a part of, there are thousands of people who are associated with that school. So there's all the faculty members, there are the students, but more than that, there are also the people who are maintaining the grounds, the people who are mowing the lawns, the people who are cutting the hedges, the people who are doing all kinds of maintenance work, people who are doing cleaning, people who work in administration, people who work in, for instance, the registrar's office or financial aid or human resources, all these different people. The only way to organize that entire mass of people is to have some type of bureaucratic system in place with all of those features that Weber's describing. So you need rules, you need division of labor, you need specialization, you need hierarchy, you need all these different things. And it gets, the importance of bureaucracy becomes even clearer when you start to think about even bigger organizations. So corporations like Walmart that has tens of thousands of employees and all kinds of very, very different types of jobs scattered all throughout the country, scattered all throughout the world. You think about a company like General Motors that has, I think, over 100,000 employees. And then you go even bigger and think about the military, for instance. It's a massive bureaucratic system. How are you going to organize the military? How are you going to organize the United States government? How are you going to organize the governments throughout the world if you don't have bureaucratic systems in place? It's really impossible. There's another big advantage over previous systems in that bureaucracies allow for the leveling of social differences. So if you think about history, throughout history there have been many, many, many examples. History is full of examples, just packed full of them, where if you were of the wrong religious background, you were cut out of different opportunities. So if you were Jewish throughout much of the medieval period and before that, you really couldn't get access to all kinds of economic opportunities. You were kept out of government jobs. There were all kinds of people wouldn't hire you for different things. All kinds of trades cut off from you, and so on. If you were, for instance, thinking about again the medieval time, if you were born a peasant, you will stay a peasant. If you're born a noble or a royal, you will stay in that social group, and there's nothing you can really do. You think about the Indian caste system. Think about all kinds of different social systems that we've had where your blood relations, your family relations, your family history, your socioeconomic background, so whether or not you came from wealth or not, your racial background, whether or not you're male or female, all these different things define what sort of opportunities you have. Well, in a perfect bureaucratic system, again, we're talking perfect bureaucratic systems, those differences go away. So in a perfect bureaucratic system, we think about it's merit, it's qualification that decides who gets what job. So you can imagine one person who comes from a wealthy, aristocratic, so comes from a family that was once nobles, let's say were descendants of medieval knights or dukes or kings or whatever, and they're wealthy, that person's white, that person's Protestant, that person is straight, the person's not gay, this person's male, and so on, and that person is up against someone whose family comes from a line of peasants, or slaves, is Muslim or atheist, is a woman, is gay, whatever, just all of those different characteristics that you can have that disadvantage you. Well, in a perfect bureaucratic system, the only thing that's supposed to determine whether or not you, for instance, get a job or a promotion or whatever is your merit, is your capacity to do the job. Now, realistically, do things always work out like that? No. But there is significant more leveling of social differences in systems governed by bureaucracies than there have been, or than there has been in any other type of social system. Think back to medieval feudalism, right? If you were born a peasant, that's what you died as. There was no leveling of social differences. In bureaucratic systems, there is the potential to move up from the lowest level to the highest level and work your way up, regardless of what your background is. There are plenty of stories of people who come from the absolute worst social backgrounds and make it up all the way to the top. Again, I don't want to give the sense that in the real world, things like sex and race and religion don't matter. They matter enormously. But bureaucracies, at minimum, give people more opportunities to move up within social systems. So for Weber, these types of organizations are absolutely essential to the modern world. You take them away, you take bureaucracies away, modern society and everything we know about modern society goes away. It doesn't exist anymore. But there are major dysfunctions of bureaucratic systems. So the first two, I'll bring these two together. First is that bureaucracies are deeply impersonal. So I made that point earlier when I was talking about official activity should be the worker's focus. When you walk into a bureaucratic system, you cease to be you as an individual and you become a generic role. So you walk into a firm and you are an accountant, well, you become a generic accountant, just like everyone else. Your political views don't matter. Your religious views don't matter. The amazing weekend you had doesn't matter. Your family problems don't matter. Whether or not your individual personality doesn't matter. You can't be you as an individual person when you are at work. You can have little hints of who you are, but nothing that is potentially disruptive. And that's really what this is all about. It's about having systems in place that function smoothly. And when you have thousands upon thousands of people, you're going to have personality differences, you're going to have political differences, you're going to have religious differences. And if everybody really acts like themselves, they allow their personalities to come out, they allow their deep values, whether religious or political values or whatever, to come out, that's going to be enormously disruptive to work. Now imagine you have two people who have to work together every day, and one of them is a conservative, evangelical Christian, and the other is a pagan, left-wing, whatever. Just they're two radically different types of people. If they are, let's say they meet on the first day and a conversation about abortion pops up, well, they're going to have very different views, very, very different passionate views, and they're not going to be able to get much work done. And over time, if they continue to discuss those kinds of things, that relationship's really going to break down to the point where it really harms the organization. So one of the big problems here, though, is that when you enter into these systems, your personality, your individuality is stripped away. And this also, I want to point out, isn't just about work. We are within bureaucratic systems constantly. When you are a customer, for instance, at McDonald's or at Best Buy or you're wherever at a restaurant, you become a generic customer. You don't relate to people as actual people. You relate in terms of roles, and they relate to you as a role. So you are a generic customer. The waiter or waitress is a generic server. The person on the other end of the technical support line at Verizon is the generic technical support helper. You are a generic customer to that person. Nobody gets involved with each other in any kind of personal way. Connected to the deep impersonality is the reality that everyone is replaceable. In bureaucratic systems, there is no one person or no one group of people that are essential to the system. Think about Framingham State University. Framingham State University could potentially be around 500 years from now. Well, every faculty member, every student, every administrator, every person who works in facilities and maintenance will be dead at that point. But the university could continue. Well, what happens when people die? What happens when people quit and leave? What happens when students graduate? Well, they're replaced. There are organizations, so take Harvard, for instance. Harvard's been a university since the 1600s. Well, everyone who was involved with Harvard at the beginning of its existence is now dead. They've all been replaced over and over again. And that allows the system to continue. So that's good for the system. The system can maintain itself over time. But there's this alienating feature here where you are always just a cog in a system, and you know, and everyone else knows, that you aren't really all that important. Everyone can be replaced. No one is essential. And that it can be psychologically harmful, right? It's you really it really strips away, or the argument anyway is that it really strips away something that might be vital about you, connected to this idea that everyone's replaceable. Bureaucracies are essentially immortal. I don't mean immortal in the sense that they can literally never go away, but they don't have a natural lifespan. Bureaucracies don't die naturally. So again, Harvard, which has been around 1600s, I believe since the 1600s anyway, could be around in 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years from now. It will go away eventually, and at some point it will cease to exist. But that could be a very long time from now. So these systems are immortal; they can continue on forever. Now that's not always a terrible thing. It's not necessarily a bad thing that they can continue for a long time, but they can grow in power and become. They can become massively powerful. So think about a company like General Motors, which has been around for a very, very long time, and it's massively huge. It employs a lot of people. It's a very wealthy company. Has a lot of impact over over government policy, over political campaigns, because they can fund politicians and so on. And you have these giant companies, typically companies, although states and things are also bureaucracies and they maintain themselves, but they can build up power over time, and they can use that power with no expiration date. They can be just as powerful in 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years as they are now, or even more powerful. Oh, and a little side note, I should have had a little sub note down here, but part of this immortality, well, it's not really part necessarily of the immortality, but another aspect of not being mortal, not being physically mortal. Human beings have bodies, we die, but also you can't really punish bureaucracies in the same way you punish people. So when bureaucracies do things that are bad, well, how do you punish them? Well, the individual people in these systems are part of systems. They're just doing their job. They're just following rules. So you can't really punish them individually unless they themselves individually have violated laws. But you can have bureaucratic systems that violate laws where no individual person violates a law. So how do you punish them? Well, they're huge. You can't imprison them. You can't execute them. So what do? It becomes this really serious problem. So then we have red tape. Red tape is probably a phrase that you've heard of. So red tape implies paperwork or rules that get in the way of actually getting work done. And so we talked earlier about how the rules are essential, paperwork is essential to the functioning of these organizations. But what can happen over time is rules can get put in place, and then people essentially forget why those rules are there. Or rules get put in place, and then the situations change, or the conditions change, where maybe once that rule was necessary, but now it isn't. But the rule is still there. If nobody's looking for rules to get rid of, then those rules stay in place forever, unless someone gets rid of them, which is really, really hard to do because people are trained to follow rules. They're not trained to question rules. And so you end up with these rules that can get in the way of getting work done rather than allowing work to get done. I have a whole story that I won't say it now because it's like a 10-minute long story, but I talk about it when I'm in face-to-face classes, where I bought a snowblower from Sears. And I brought my snowblower out on the first big snowstorm that I had it, and within seconds, my right tire popped on the snowblower. And getting to a person who could help me with the snowblower situation took me hours, literally hours. I ended up making a series of phone calls where, if you include transfers between departments and actual phone calls, I made somewhere between 11, 12 different phone calls. So I was talking to 11, 12 different people, sometimes the same person over and over again. I would get transferred from different person to different person, and they had all these hoops to jump through because everyone's following these crazy rules, and it was just became bizarre. Now maybe all those rules made perfect sense on their end, but they certainly didn't on my end. And I'm sure you guys have all faced this. If you ever, had to take a course at another university, if you're a transfer student, if you try to transfer courses that you take over the summer or something, there's just so much paperwork to fill out. You get signatures from all these different people, and it can take a long time, and it gets to the point where it really feels like all of that work just gets in the way of actually accomplishing something that should be relatively simple and straightforward. Now, again, there might be very good reasons why those rules are in place, but oftentimes there are not very good reasons why rules are in place, but they stay there forever. Or not forever, but they could potentially stay there forever. And all of these different issues culminate in a kind of alienation that Weber describes. That he's not talking about alienation in the same way that Marx does. So he's not talking about alienation in terms of separation from your capacity to work, but he is discussing alienation in the context of, or while thinking about your separation from your own capacity to work creatively, your capacity to express yourself, your capacity to be a human being, your capacity to have a personality, your capacity to be an individual, your capacity to make decisions. All of those things are essentially stripped away from you once you enter into these bureaucratic systems. And we'll see in a second how bureaucratic systems are everywhere. You are almost always within the context of a bureaucratic system. In fact, as you listen to this recording, you are operating within the context of at least 3 different bureaucratic systems all at the same time. And that really limits you in some pretty serious ways. But anyway, so back to I'll elaborate on that point in a minute. But what happens to people is that as their individuality, their creativity, and so on gets stripped away, people become mindless rule followers. So people just don't ever have to think for themselves. They take on the particular role that they have in the organization, be it dock worker, be it accountant, be it a manager, be it cashier, whatever. People just mindlessly follow the rules as they have been laid down by the bureaucratic system and for that particular job. So there's no thought. And also, when you walk into a bureaucracy as a customer or as a student or as a user of the products that the bureaucracy produces, you also end up being bound by these really tightly regulating, or these really confining rules that are in many ways crushing, according to Weber. So I want to address this question then really quickly of how much time you spend in bureaucratic systems. So as I go through this talk, and as you read through Weber's discussion in The Bureaucratic Machine, which hopefully you read, you might think, well, I don't spend a lot of time in these systems, or you might think that you only really deal with these systems when you're at work. But that's really not true. Whenever you go shopping, for instance, unless you're shopping at a small mom-and-pop store somewhere, which there are very few of those, then you are within a bureaucratic system. Even then, you're still dealing with bureaucratic systems because the mom-and-pop store is probably buying products from these big companies. But if you go to the mall and you're at a Best Buy, or you are at a Sears or a Macy's or Banana Republic or any of these stores, these are giant bureaucratic systems, and you follow their rules when you enter into their stores. And if you work there, it's the same thing. When you go to McDonald's, when you follow their rules, you'll read about that in the Rationalization of Society article. And if you take a look at the Robin Liedner article, which might be useful for depending on what paper you end up writing about, or paper topic you choose, you'll see that in McDonald's it's so tightly regulated that everyone from customers to employees are just amazingly predictable. But it's even beyond that. So shopping, work. So whenever you're shopping, you're at work, you're in one of these systems. Well, what about when you're socializing with friends? Well, how do we socialize with friends a lot of times? Well, through, for instance, digital media. So we socialize through Facebook. Well, Facebook is a giant bureaucratic system. When you want to socialize with people within the context of Facebook or using Facebook, you have to follow their rules. So if someone, you want to make an announcement to the world, how do you do that? Well, you do that with a status update. How can people respond? Well, they can respond through comments. Well, how can other people respond in other ways? Well, that you can respond by hitting a like button. And they just made a change to the like button now that you can just do a generic thumbs up like, but you can also do things like an angry face to show that you're mad, or a laughing face to show that you're whatever it is funny. But you're still limited to the emotions that Facebook allows you to express. For a long time, people, up until very, very recently, and still probably at this point now, there are all these comments all the time about, well, isn't there a dislike button? Well, it's not a technical problem. Facebook could have easily instituted a dislike button, but they chose not to. Well, what if you want to say dislike? Well, then you have to write a comment, which people are much less likely to do. It's much easier to hit a like button than it is to write a comment, so people weren't able to express themselves in a particular way, which is fine, but it's limiting. You are interacting within the context of Facebook's rules and Facebook's systems. Well, what about other sorts of things? Well, Twitter, same sort of thing. You're limited to 140 characters. That's not a technical issue. That just they chose 140 characters because it is connected to text messaging. Although Twitter now has no real technical connection to text messaging, but they still operate using that model. Actually sending text messages and so on, that you're limited you're by the technology there as well. So there are real implications here. The social interactions you have with people become very efficient in the sense that you can have, for instance, large numbers of friends. And if I were face to face, I would have friends in air quotes. Where you can interact with in very quick, efficient ways. So, for instance, I have a friend who had a baby recently. She announced that she had a baby. Actually, my cousin had a baby a couple days ago. I haven't talked to her. I haven't visited her. I hit like on her announcement on Facebook, and I feel like, okay, I've done my job as a family member. I should probably call her, actually. That's reminding me. But still, I acknowledged her baby. I have other friends who, same way, I haven't seen them in forever. Other sorts of circumstances, pre-Facebook time, I would have had to either call them or go visit them. But now I can just hit a like button or say congratulations in a comment. And I have, quickly and efficiently congratulated and acknowledged my friend's life change. So, these bureaucratic systems do allow us to be really efficient in terms of managing our time and getting things done. But you wonder how much you lose. And Weber would make the case that we lose a lot here. We lose not just our self-control, but we lose also our capacity to really connect with others, or our ability or our opportunities to connect with others really get stripped away in these systems, and they are everywhere. Just to take a second and reflect on how much time you spend outside of bureaucratic systems. If you're watching TV with friends, family, bureaucratic system, you're interacting through the media that's in front of you. You're shopping. You are out to eat. You're at any kind of entertainment place, either a retailer, or you're at the movies, or you're at a theme park, or you're at a spa, or whatever. These are all bureaucratic systems. You're in them all the time. And Weber's making the case that when you are in those systems, either as a customer, an employee, or whatever, you are you experience all that impersonality. You are bound by these tight rules, and so on. And so Weber goes on to make the case that this type of organizing, this way of organizing society, is going to continue, and it's going to become more and more prevalent. It's going to just grow everywhere. And I think his prediction has turned out to be pretty accurate. So Weber was writing in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and he predicted that rationalization, this process, so let's take a look at the definition. So rationalization is this ongoing process in which social interactions and institutions are increasingly governed by methodical rules and procedures. Essentially what that's saying is that over time, bureaucracies would come to take over more and more aspects of people's lives. And Weber was horrified at the rationalization that was happening in his own time, when it wasn't anywhere near as bad as it is now. And I shouldn't say as bad, because that implies that I'm making a moral judgment here, although Weber certainly thought it was bad. And I think individually, I think in a lot of ways it's bad too. But it certainly has become much more prevalent. For instance, when Weber was writing, people's social lives would have been much freer from rationalization than now. But now people's social lives are really, I hate to use this phrase, but people's social lives are deeply colonized by technology. That means technology is really moving into our social lives and rationalizing them. Well, this increasing rationalization becomes a threat to individuality and creativity. People become increasingly governed by rules and procedures rather than wants and desires. I should have also had a note here too. I'm just realizing that it's not just about people's individuality and creativity. It's also, again, about people's capacity to connect with each other. Good example I had of that, I was giving a face-to-face lecture about this topic, and I had a student raise her hand, and she gave this example where she had gotten a text message from one of her good friends. I think she had actually said her best friend. And the text message said that this friend had broken up with her boyfriend. And so her friend was very, very upset. And so under other circumstances, if her friend had approached her and told her face-to-face that she had just broken up with her boyfriend, my student would have had to respond. She would have had to offer support. It wouldn't have mattered what was going on in my student's life at that point. She would have had to put other things aside and comfort her friend, talk to her friend, and be there in that moment where, it's an inconvenient thing to have happen. It's an upsetting thing to have happen, but you're engaged with another human being emotionally, interpersonally. The friendship over time will be strengthened, and the relationships grow stronger, and they become more real and more intense. Well, what ended up happening instead is that she gets this text, and so she was busy with doing some assignment or something. And so she looked at her text, and she knew her friend was upset, but she looked at the text, read it, and said to herself, okay, I can't deal with this now. And she didn't respond. Now, her friend has no way of knowing that she didn't know. But she looked at her friend's text and said, okay, I can't deal with this now. Her friend is upset, clearly reaching out for help. But the girl who got the text, understandably, wasn't able to deal with it, so she did what she had to do, and she eventually called her friend back. But she was able to avoid that emotional engagement in that moment. And by the time she did get back to her friend, I mean, the rawness of the emotion was probably reduced at that point, maybe not completely, but it's still going to be less of an intense interaction. The friendship itself isn't going to be as strengthened when you provide immediate support for someone going through a crisis. That is going to strengthen the friendship more than a delayed reaction, maybe also by text or maybe by phone, so that, again, you don't have the face-to-face interaction. You don't have the physical interaction where you can give somebody a hug or hold them while they cry or whatever. And so, we see this stripping away not just of individual creativity, individual personality, individuality, but also this stripping away of social relations. So I've already actually given some examples. So I mentioned social interactions mediated by Facebook, but there's others as well. So if you've ever gone on a cruise, you really don't get much more rationalized than cruises. So if you've ever gone on a cruise, you might not notice it, but I had somebody point this out to me. Cruises are, the schedule for a cruise is built in 45-minute increments. So everything is 45 minutes long. So you go to a show, it's 45 minutes. You go to some other event, it's 45 minutes. The reason why is because the crew, the people who are running the ship, need to be able to churn through different types of events, different types of shows, and all these different things. And it's just much more convenient for them to have everything structured in 45-minute increments. So it becomes this need to follow the schedule so that the cruise goers can experience the most number of things in the most efficient way possible. And that's what these prepackaged vacations like cruises, bus tours, and so on become all about. So if you're on a cruise, you go on these excursions. Well, let's say, okay, you have 4 hours to explore this rainforest. I was on one cruise once where we had a couple hours. I think it was like a 4-hour excursion, and I think about 45 minutes of that was spending time in this ancient ruin in Mexico. And so we had 45 minutes, which was not enough time at all, because we had other things to do too. We were on this bus, and we had 45 minutes in this one spot, and then we had this 20-minute drive where we had to go to this other spot where there was lunch waiting for us at this particular time. Well, what if you're not, done with the ruin? Well, too bad. You get back on the bus. Well, what if you aren't hungry when it gets to be lunchtime? Well, too bad. That's when we are stopping for food. Well, what if you want to get something that's more elaborate, different food? Well, we go to a particular place that has food prepared for us in advance, and it's fit into the amount of time that we have. And then after we ate, I think we went snorkeling or something. And it was all just laid out. Now, that's a very efficient way for the company to move lots of people through these vacation experiences. And I put experiences in quotes again because it's less about really experiencing anything and more about kind of mentally checking things off the list. Okay, I saw the ruin. Check. Forget the fact that you didn't really get to experience the ruin. I had lunch in Mexico. Okay, forget the fact that the lunch that you had was this pre-packaged food that was, out of a box. There was no local cuisine in there at all. But still, you can still say to yourself, okay, I had lunch in Mexico. Check. Okay, I went snorkeling. Okay, well, you went snorkeling for, an hour or so. Was that really enough time to explore the reef or explore the wildlife that's there? Well, no, but you can mentally check that off your list. So you've you had a lot of efficient experiences, but you strip away a lot of the meaning behind it. Things like automatic cash registers, they prevent interaction between human beings at stores and things. We could spend a lot of time talking about The experience is now going to, for instance, a grocery store, which is deeply impersonal, and you can avoid dealing with people at all, versus going to the country store where you knew everybody, including the people who own the store, people who work there, and so on. That experience would have been very different in the past, but now we don't really have that social interaction. One thing you're probably pretty surprised by, though, I would guess that you're surprised, is that professors oftentimes are offered, or very often offered, these canned lectures. So when we assign a textbook, a lot of times the textbook authors or the textbook companies will provide us things like lecture notes, will provide us pre-made PowerPoint presentations. So you could today get one of these sets of PowerPoint lectures. You could be in a classroom tomorrow lecturing, using their lecture notes, using their textbook, using their PowerPoint, giving a lecture to a class about a subject you know nothing about, but just following along with the notes that are there. What about things like exams? Well, they give us exams too, or exam questions. They give us these big bundles of questions that we can put together in all kinds of different ways. They give us software to manage all this stuff. And you see that more and more. It's really unfortunate because you think of the professor at the front of the room as an expert, as someone who just knows the material because they spent their lives dealing with it and dedicated to it and all this. But that is very often not the case. It's very often instead somebody just presenting what some textbook author, actually probably not even the author of the textbook, probably just some random, either graduate student or somebody at the publishing company, just that someone else just threw together, and that's what your education is. So you're paying for college education from experts, and you end up getting, what the person at Pearson or Sage Publishing happened to throw together in a couple hours as they're also trying to do all their other work. So, we can see this gradual stripping away of experience from people's lives. And so all of this ultimately culminates in what Weber calls disenchantment. And so we're very close to the end of the lecture at this point, but this is where it gets even a little bit darker, where this disenchantment, well, what the disenchantment is, it's the replacement of religion and tradition as ways of organizing life with the drive for efficiency. So in the past we had, religion that would make the world seem like, not necessarily a magical place, but it would make the world seem like a meaningful place. We had tradition that made the world feel like a meaningful place. So religion gave you stories about your place in the universe. If you're a Christian, for instance, your religion tells you, depending on your type of Christian, but for the most part, Christians have this idea that God loves them, God's out for them, God's taking care of them. A lot of religions have that kind of idea as well. But regardless, it gives you a place in the universe. It also gives you explanations for how the world works. So if you grew up with ancient Greek mythology, well, why is the sun coming across the sky? Well, it's because a god is pulling it in a chariot, and you can, if you need help, you can make sacrifices to that god, and that god can come out of the sky and help you. Well, what if you're a primitive communist and you're a nomadic hunter-gatherer, and you're essentially a nature worshiper? Well, that gives you a sense that the world around you is really alive, and that volcano over there is erupting because it's the will of some spirit, and the world is this life-giving place, and there's all these spirits behind it. And tradition as well can also give you a place in time and space. So if you're a medieval farmer, you're going to have fewer questions about what you're supposed to do with your life, because you know that you're part of a long tradition that might go back hundreds or even thousands of years, and that gives you a sense of meaning in your life. Well, that's all eventually or gradually gets undermined by this process of rationalization. It all gets driven out. So tradition goes away because we're constantly trying to come up with more efficient ways of doing things. So, rather than making things by hand from start to finish, we move to assembly lines. Rather than trying to have a regular family dinner or a regular meeting with friends as a tradition, well, what do? We send people greeting cards. In the past or now, we send people just a happy birthday on their birthday, and that's it, and we don't see them because it's quick and efficient. It's allows us to get more stuff done, but it undermines social meaning. So this drive for efficiency, this drive to get more and more done, becomes the central organizing principle of our lives. And the big problem there is that it's really hard to derive any kind of meaning from that drive for efficiency. We get a lot more done than people ever have. We produce a lot more stuff than people ever have. We we are much more active, but we're left with this sense of meaninglessness that leaves us essentially adrift in the world. So there's instability. Also, the fact that this drive for efficiency leads us to change the way we live constantly. So it's hard for us to imagine this, but prior to maybe 100 or so years ago, people's lives are pretty stable from generation to generation. If you go back to medieval farming days, the life that you had if you were in the year 1000 isn't going to be that much different, or wouldn't have been that much different from the people who lived 500 years from you, 500 years before you. Now, there's instability from year to year. I mean, God, I think back to what life was like before I had my iPhone, and I can't even really remember because before I had an iPhone, if I was out somewhere and I wanted a piece of information, I just didn't know that thing. If I wanted to remember a song lyric, or I wanted to remember a phone number, or I wanted to remember something important, and I didn't have my phone with me, or I didn't have an iPhone at that point, I just didn't know that thing. I could find it out when I got home, and I can Google it. Well, what about what life was like before Google and Yahoo and search engines? Well, then you just really just didn't know it. You had to go to the library or look it up in an encyclopedia or something. I mean, it's hard for us to imagine, life before right now. But 5 years ago, 10 years ago, before smartphones, our lives were radically different. And before the internet, our lives are radically different. Before TV, our lives are radically different. Before modern medicine, our lives are radically different. Before where we work now, our lives are radically different, and so on. So there's really just a lot of change, and that allows us to again get more stuff. But there's nothing really for us to grab onto, for us to use to anchor our lives and to make sense of our lives. I think maybe I've given enough examples that I don't really need to get into this, but science drives this process as well. Science has a tendency to undermine religion. It certainly undermines tradition because it gets us to do things differently, but also science can often challenge religion as well. So it's another way that the world is disenchanted. You can also, so we can see that in thinking about creation myths. So if we think about origin of life in terms of religion, so God created human beings and the world, and that can infuse the world with meaning. It gives you some sense of order in the world, compared to something like evolution, where we're essentially I'm greatly oversimplifying. The theory is not really like this, but we're essentially kind of accidents of biology. That can give you a sense that you are sort of less or certainly not important in the world. Now, we need to be aware of evolution so that we can do things like have effective medical treatment so that we understand how the world works, but it certainly strips meaning away from our lives. So all of these things together, especially the sort of bureaucracy, the rule stuff, end up and the increasing confinement of these rules lead us to ultimately be trapped in what Weber refers to as the iron cage of rationality. So I really like this metaphor. So we have a cage, it's imprisoning, right? We are constrained, our freedom is taken away from us. It's iron. Iron is cold and hard, and it's unyielding, it doesn't bend. So we're trapped in this iron cage of rationality. We are trapped in these deeply, deeply impersonal, uncreative, these systems where we can't express ourselves, these systems of rules that just control us to the point where there's very little we can do. Here are some what I think of as useful quotes from Weber. One, his idea that this is just going to continue. So the iron cage is just going to get tighter and tighter and tighter and more constraining. So he thinks it's going to continue when he writes the further advance of bureaucratic mechanization is inevitable. And then right here, this gets at his idea of, or his sense of what it's like to be caught in one of these bureaucratic systems. So he writes the individual bureaucrat, and so that a bureaucrat is just somebody who's working in these systems. But we can extend this idea to, again, customers or users of Facebook or whatever. The individual bureaucrat cannot squirm out of the apparatus into which he has been harnessed. He is only a small cog in a ceaseless moving mechanism, which prescribes to him an essentially fixed route of march. So you get caught up in these systems, and you are a small part of those systems, and those systems provide you, or they give you, an essentially fixed route of march. What that means is they force you to act in very specific ways, and you can't escape from those systems. And then he has this question here about, how can we actually protect ourselves from these kinds of bureaucratic systems? And he doesn't ever really give a good answer. He really thinks that we're going to end up in a pretty horrible sort of life circumstances. He actually had a nervous breakdown, partially because of this. Also because of something, his son died and things, but he had a very negative outlook. So yeah, so he saw that this is a very crushing process. And so our last thing I want to just point out is this question about what about socialism. So for Marx, socialism would have been a utopia, but for Weber, socialism would have been an absolute nightmare. The reason why is because capitalism is very dynamic, or at least has the potential to be dynamic, and people have the potential for self-control. So if you want to start your own business, you can. Now, there's certainly restrictions on that, all the restrictions that Marx talked about. So, it's hard to, for instance, start a business to compete against Walmart. You're not going to survive in the market and so on. But if you work in one place and it's awful, you can quit and work somewhere else that maybe is a little less alienating, a little less dehumanizing. But there's at least the potential for small pockets of life to not be controlled by bureaucratic systems. But for Weber, in socialism, when everything is essentially handed over to the public realm, everything is going to be managed by the collective, by the state, what that implies is even more bureaucracy. So we're talking about more intrusion, more rules that are going to be more crushing and oppressive. Now, this doesn't mean he thought capitalism wasn't going to be crushing and oppressive. He just thought in capitalism there was at least the potential for small spaces, not a lot, but the small spaces where you are protected from this iron cage of rationality. Well, most of your time you're going to be crushed by these rules, but in some cases you wouldn't be. But in socialism, the system would be that much stronger, and that it would have that much more control. Okay. So that's it for Weber's discussion of rationalization and bureaucracy. I'm hoping that you are seeing the connections between his discussion of Protestant ethic and how this drive for efficiency emerged within the context of this creation of the Protestant ethic in the spirit of capitalism. That is something I will very likely ask about on the exam. So if you made it all the way through to the end of this lecture, then you got a little hint about what's coming up. So feel free to ask me any questions you have about any of this stuff, and I will, we'll be talking later.